Greetings, students, and welcome to part 2 of this screencast on the history of evolutionary thought and natural selection. Here we're going to focus more on natural selection. So we ended the last screencast with this acronym VEER, which we're going to use to describe how this process of natural selection takes place. So let's break it down here. The V stands for variation. So variation exists. That is critical for natural selection to work. An example of this, human population, Danny DeVito, Michael Jordan, members of the same species, yet very, very different. You don't have to look far. You can look at the variation amongst dogs, the variation in the produce section of the grocery store, the variation amongst flowers in the meadow where you walk with a loved one, holding hands, I don't know. So variation exists in nature. Second, the environment, E, creates challenges. Not all organisms can possibly survive. This is kind of the tragic little tale of biology. Lots of things die. So here you have a whole bunch of sea turtles. They've hatched from their eggs and they're heading from the beach to the water. And what you don't realize is a lot of those things are going to get picked off on the way. Birds descend on them and pick them off. Sometimes snakes descend on them and pick them off. Once they get into the water, sharks and other fish pick them off. Those that make it, humans, pollute and pick them off. So a lot of things die because of that. Not all can possibly survive. But some individuals have traits that give them an advantage, A, allowing them to live longer and produce more offspring. So obviously this moth blends in. That's a helpful trait. It's going to help it survive a little bit longer. This thing, I don't even know what it is. It blends in so well. So if you have an advantage, you're going to live longer. And that brings us to R, reproduction occurs. Those favorable traits, since you're able to live longer and produce more offspring, they're going to be passed on, and those favorable traits are going to become more common. And I'll pause so you can admire the adorable little baby animals. Okay, so again, VEER, I'll just go through again. Variation, environment creates challenges, advantage for those who have a favorable trait, and reproduction to pass on that favorable trait. So you need to be careful when talking about natural selection because there's a lot of myths that come up, ways that people talk about this that aren't quite right. So myth number one is that individual organisms can adapt or evolve. Not true. Organisms, individuals cannot evolve. Only populations can evolve. So your genotype, phenotype, that's just how you are. That doesn't evolve or change. But certain genes can become more common over many generations. So, in Pokemon, where you have this cute little whatever guy that I recognize from Smash Brothers, I think he evolves into that thing. I don't know enough, but basically that's not right. That little guy doesn't evolve into that guy. You'd have a population of these, and certain traits would become more common. A second one is that adapting, this is a myth now, a myth is adapting is purposeful and related to intelligence. When we think of adaptation like I'm going to adapt, we think that we're adapting to change. That's not really how we mean this in the context of evolution. Natural selection just kind of happens. There's no thought, there's no intent, it just happens. So if you got a bunch of moths on this tree trunk, those dark ones are going to stand out and be picked off, and that white trait is going to become more common over time. Likewise, if you have a darker tree trunk, the white moths are going to be picked off. So there's no intent or purpose. It just kind of happens. And third myth, species adapt because they need to. Again, there is no need to evolve. It just kind of happens. And so there's a lot of things, species that are in real trouble because of climate change. And people think, oh, well, things will just adapt. They need to adapt. Well, it doesn't work that way. You can only adapt when there's enough variation and plenty of time for many generations to accumulate those things. So as you're writing about natural selection, you want to be careful to avoid those three myths. Last up, I want to talk about some examples of evolution. This is not theoretical. We can see this in our everyday lives. So an example of evolution, of natural selection in particular, is antibiotic resistance. So an antibiotic is a drug. It's a medication used to kill bacteria. So if you have a bacterial infection, like maybe you have strep throat, you might be prescribed an antibiotic to kill it. So the problem with that is that sometimes those, like the strep bacteria, can become resistant. So imagine you have this population of bacteria. These are strep bacteria, and there's just a handful that happen to be resistant to an antibiotic. Well, if you expose this population to that antibiotic, it's going to kill almost the entire population. But some have an advantage and are going to survive, specifically these resistant ones. And then when they reproduce, they're going to pass on that resistance to the next generation. And if we continue to expose this population to this antibiotic, eventually the entire population is going to be largely resistant to the antibiotic. And this is happening right now. We're losing a lot of our antibiotics because we are overusing them. And the more we use them, the more we allow these resistant bacteria to survive and pass on that resistance gene. And that's why we need to be careful with how we use antibiotics. Another example of evolution is artificial selection. So artificial selection is very similar to natural selection, but in this case, humans are selecting for traits to be passed on. In natural selection, the environment sort of selects for traits based on what helps you survive and reproduce. Here, humans pick. So an example of this is dogs. Dogs descended from wolves. And humans domesticated these wolves, and then they said, hey, let's breed for smaller and smaller and smaller dogs, and eventually we get these little tiny cute guys. Or, let's select for longer hair and we get this kind of thing. Or let's select for larger ears and we get that little guy, So humans have sort of essentially created all these different breeds by selecting for certain traits. That's called artificial selection. We do this with plants too. Behold the wild mustard plant. It's just a regular old plant. You'd walk by it and think nothing of it. But over many generations, humans have sort of bred this and selected for certain things. By selecting for larger leaves, it gave rise to kale. By selecting for other traits, we got cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kohlrabi, all from this guy, and by selecting for certain characteristics over many generations. Another example of how evolution can take place, this figure sort of breaks down three different ways that natural selection can take a population. Divergent is where two populations become more different from one another. So those Galapagos finch species that we talked about, where they arrive on the island and start to change, that's an example of divergent, where they become different from one another. Convergent evolution is where two species become more similar to one another. And so you may have heard that dolphins are not fish. They are in fact mammals. They are not related to fish really at all. And yet superficially, they do kind of look like sharks, which are fish. Why is that? Well, this is a result of convergent evolution. This body shape with the kind of pointy snout helps them move through the water. These fins stabilize them in the water and help them steer. And so they have converged on this kind of similar body shape because that body shape is advantageous in the watery environment that they're in. Finally, coevolution. This is where two species evolve in response to one another. And so it's kind of like if one changes, then the other changes in response, and then the other changes in response, and so on. So an example of this, there's this ridiculous flower. Look at how long this thing is. Now, flowers, their goal is basically, the reason why plants have flowers is to attract insects so that those insects can spread the flower's pollen. But in order to get the insect to spread the pollen, the flower needs it to kind of nuzzle up against that flower. And so natural selection, the way flowers lure the insects is by putting sugar, nectar, at the base of this thing. So basically, natural selection favors flowers with a little bit longer petal so that the insects have to really nuzzle up against there to get the food source that they're after. And in doing that, the insects will pick up the pollen and then spread it and help this flower reproduce. So natural selection has sort of favored slightly longer flowers. And so natural selection has also then favored insects with a longer and longer proboscis here, because that allows it to reach farther and get that food way at the bottom. So basically, natural selection favors a slightly longer flower, which favors a slightly longer proboscis. But then that favors a slightly longer flower and a slightly longer proboscis, slightly longer, and it just kind of runs away until you get this ridiculous scenario where you have this huge long flower and this huge long proboscis. And so coevolution is where they sort of change in response to each other. So that's pretty much it. We've looked at the history of evolutionary thought, including Lamarck and Charles Darwin. We looked at some observations that led Darwin to conclude that organisms evolve. We've summarized natural selection, descent with modification, and Lamarck's false idea, now known to be false idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. We've contrasted artificial and natural selection, and we've looked at convergent, divergent, and coevolution. It's been fun, hasn't it? We'll have to do it again sometime. Peace out, children.